Welcome to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Leslie Stevenson and I'm the publisher of Governance Journal. We're delighted so many of you are able to join us on this really important topic of sustainability. The webinar is being recorded and we will send out a link to it probably at the beginning of next week, together with an invitation to sign up for our free monthly journal all about everything governance, to do governance. Please feel free to ask questions. We're going to have about half an hour of the panelists talking to each other, and then we will open it out for questions. So the best way to do that is if you could put any questions in the Q&A facility. That just means that we can record them. And then so just do that as the panelists are going through, so you can put the questions in as they pop into your head, and then I will facilitate that. And we will finish bang on 1 o'clock. So just to briefly introduce you to the panelists, Susan Hooper is a board member of Chapter Zero. She's also chair of Tangle Teaser, and she sits on the boards of Uber UK and Moonpig PLC, where she's chair of the Remuneration Committee and ESG lead. She's involved in several startups in carbon capture and sustainability, and is also an ambassador for the World Travel and Tourism Council. Richard Sheath is a founding partner of Independent Audit and has supported boards on improving effectiveness for over 20 years. He's also served as Audit and Risk Committee Chairman on the boards of several large globally operating companies, and is the author of Independent Audit's monthly bulletin, The Effective Board, and a regular contributor to several governance publications, including my own, on risk-related subjects. Loren Wulfsohn is an international corporate governance practitioner in financial services, acting as a trusted advisor to both boards and the executive, and she has extensive experience in navigating complex environments in multiple jurisdictions. She's an admitted attorney, and she's got a Master of Laws in Banking and Stock Exchange Law, and was a winner in the 2021 Governance Hot 100 Awards for Innovation. So I'm going to hand you over to Richard, who's going to chair this, and I hope you all really enjoy the webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Leslie, and a good afternoon to everybody. We're going to actually start by conducting a very quick poll because as we were preparing for this webinar last week, we were recognizing that different companies, different organizations are often at very different stages of development, and their boards are often in different levels of maturity in relation to how they actually approach the topic of sustainability and their level of understanding of sustainability. So we thought we'd just ask you a few questions so that you can position your board in that respect, so that gives us a bit of a feel for who we're talking to and how we can perhaps then adapt the way we address some of the questions. So if you could kind of just take a quick few seconds to read through the question and then just say where you think your board sits on this scale. And then Leslie assures me that the results will pop up automatically. So let's hope that actually happens.
Can you not see the results?
No, we can see the questions at the moment, Leslie.
Okay, so I can see the well, if they don't pop up, I'll tell you.
Okay.
We've still got some people answering. Okay, so the first point, our directors are well informed and they take sustainability seriously and make sure it is fully embedded across the organisation. We've got 32% people have said that. Our directors are very aware of the significance of sustainability, but it isn't seen as a current priority. That's 48%. Our directors do not see sustainability as an issue for us. That's 10%. And I don't know what our directors think. It isn't discussed, is 13%.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful to give us a bit of a picture as to where your organizations sit. So actually, why don't we start with just a few quick reactions from Loren and from Susan to those results? I found the split quite interesting, actually. But Lauren, you go first. What do you think that's telling us?
I think there's a level of comfort that a third of people on the call are well on the road to obviously implementation and feel confident about where they stand. But it is a third only, and there are 2/3 that are, I guess, still seeing it as a challenge and something that they need to get right with boards and in the environments. And I guess more disturbing is 10% who think that they don't discuss it at all. And at this stage, that's, I guess, great to have you on the call, and hopefully the discussion can be of help in moving your discussion forward.
Susan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I also think that makes that highlights why talking about this topic is very difficult, because everyone's at a different stage of development, and the hardest thing to do is make this useful and constructive for everyone, because if you're already halfway up the learning curve, the basic stuff doesn't appeal to you so much, and if you haven't got any role models and you're down at the bottom, some of the further along suggestions and references that we might make are less useful. So I think it's really important on this topic to remember that we're on a journey, and that and we're all over the place with regards to that journey, and we're learning on that journey, and we have to adjust as we go along, which makes a task of being on a panel on this topic quite challenging, I think. So here's hoping that it's going to be useful what we talk about.
Yeah, and hopefully organisations, when they're on this journey, aren't going around in too many circles, and especially not doing too many U-turns. It's the risk that we're hearing about at the moment. So no, I think that's right. And one thing I find when working with many different types of boards is that for some, they're actually struggling to see the relevance beyond their own sort of electricity usage and carbon burn and air miles. It's quite difficult for the board to actually really think through any external impact or responsibility they have, and that's perhaps reflected in that range of poll results. But let's get to the question in hand for the webinar, which is really around sustainability. What do boards really need to know? And I suggest there's probably two angles to this. One, which is what do they need to know about what they're doing internally, but also what do they need to know about external perceptions of them as an organization and what those external expectations are. So I'd like to start off by asking Lauren, where do you think a board should be by now in terms of actually really understanding and sustainability and what it means for their organization? And maybe you can think of a sort of a top 3 of steps that a board should have taken by now.
Yeah, and I refer back to Susan's first bullet point, I guess, in my response, and that it's really difficult to say where you should be because it is such an individual journey. But I guess ideally where a board should be at this stage in the process, both whether you are at a mature stage of implementation or just starting out, to be comfortable, I think, as a board, you should be fully aware of where your material risks lie, and you should have a clear view of where those material risks are and how you've mapped them to your organization, whether it be from a business perspective and mapped to strategic direction, or purely from a governance framework perspective and understanding where those risks lie and how they're being monitored and how they're going to be managed. And I think that certainly at this stage, you would also want to have some view around what your targets might be and how those are similarly being managed around, are they credible? Are you confident about the level of if you've set targets in relation to any sustainability matters, are you confident as a board that you know the pathway to get there? And are you monitoring that and making sure that you get there from an oversight perspective? And I think thirdly also is, once you've got your maps and you know sort of what direction you want to be going in, it's about that path to integration. How well has sustainability been integrated into the organization? At this stage, you don't necessarily, you don't want it to be an add-on, something that's tagged onto what you do. You want it to be fully integrated into your processes, your thinking, your decision-making. So to be comfortable as a board member, that's where I'd ideally like to be. And if you're not there yet, it's how do you get on that journey to make sure that that's what you're working towards.
Right. And can I just ask, Lauren, you used the word risk there in terms of the board being in a good position to identify its risks. What about the opportunities, the strategic opportunities, though? I mean, presumably,
no, 100%.
More important.
Yeah, and I think that's where, I think reporting requirements start the narrative, but they don't complete it. So things like TCFD, which measures risks and opportunities, I think set a good groundwork for people to start those conversations if they haven't started. But absolutely, it isn't just about risks, and that's what makes the conversation turn from a grudge purchase into something positive and driven, is when the board can also acknowledge what those opportunities might be. So at the same time that a board is looking at the risks, one's also got to be saying, on the other hand, these are the risks, but there's also these great opportunities, and how are we going to benefit from them, and how do we make sure that our activities not only monitor the risks, but also are driving towards taking advantage of the potential opportunities that might come out of this.
That's key, isn't it, to getting the hearts and minds in the organization. And Susan, where do you think boards should be by now, recognizing, as you said, there's that range, but as an absolute minimum, where do you think they should be?
To be perfectly honest, I think a lot of this is being dictated by regulation and policy, which is now in place. Which, although it used to be a 4-letter word, regulation, I'm actually very glad about it, because it does mean that you have to start going. I think from a board's perspective, though, I think one of the things that absolutely has to have been discussed by now is what the overarching ambition is of the organization. This isn't a project. This is a transformation of companies to ensure that sustainability is embedded in their corporate strategy. And to do that, you have to really kind of think, what do I see? Can we articulate what we will look like 5 years from now when this plan starts to get traction? Excuse me. And so the strategic ambition for me is absolutely fundamental. And if that isn't yet clear, I think that is an issue right now, because the reality is you could fill out a lot of these regulatory requirements and tick the boxes. But if you don't have a vision of where you're going to go, that's going to really cause quite a lot of issues. I think one other prerequisite I would say is, if you are, I'm assuming that everyone on this call is a concerned board member, concerned to understand what needs to be done on sustainability. And sustainability is one of these rather challenging topics where you have to be informed. You don't have to be a climate scientist, but you have to be informed. And if you feel that you are not, or your board members are not, you need to take steps towards informing yourself. And I hasten to add, it's not about becoming a climate scientist. It's about understanding what the key traits are that you need to be able to recognize within that ambition, and how that's going to get reflected. So I won't repeat what Loren said, because they are fundamentals in terms of metrics and targeting and all of that. But I think the softer side is, are you clear on the ambition? Are you on your way, or educated, or on your way to be educated on this topic? And what about the rest of your board?
And this question of having an overarching ambition, what would you say to those companies where it's not immediately apparent? I mean, it's relatively apparent, or should be very apparent, for example, manufacturing entities, extraction industry, insurance companies, banks, etc. There's more obvious where their activity has a direct impact. But what would you say to those companies who are thinking, well, I'm not really sure that we have that much of an impact, apart, we can manage our own carbon output, but what else can we do?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, Loren already touched on it, is understand the materiality. So you may not be an oil and gas major, but there may be a part of your supply chain that does have a serious impact on the environment. Until you understand that, it's hard to answer that question. But I also think that with sustainability, you mentioned already the opportunities. There are opportunities not just of efficiency, performance, but also of an ability to attract talent that come with embracing this as a part of your corporate overarching strategy, even if you are not a heavy emitter. So I think the challenge, and we haven't really touched on this yet, that I think many boards have is, if your CEO does not embrace this issue, it's really hard to get traction above and beyond just conforming with regulation and governance. And if you are concerned about that as a board member, that opens up a whole other sort of hornet's nest of opportunities and issues that you will have to cover. So, and again, this is why addressing this topic is so difficult. We can give you formats, we can talk to you about regulation and governance, but if you don't have someone driving it from the senior level, the board is a more challenging place to be.
Right. So we're going to come back to that question. So let's just hold that one. But before we do that, I just want to ask you about this question of informing yourselves. You know, what does a board or an individual director really need to know? And let's first of all take the internal picture in terms of the board director actually knowing what the organization is actually doing. What would you say is the really top things that the board member needs to understand? Lauren?
I think it's a deeper understanding of the business than just what is the business and where do we make money. I think it's actually understanding sort of where those risks are and mapping your individual sustainability issues. So whether it be E or S or G, it's actually understanding how those play out in the organization and understanding where those risks are. So I think part of informing yourself, besides just getting that basic knowledge, I agree, you can't have a board of climate scientists, but you do need a board that is fully aware of ESG issues. So it's about doing that learning and upskilling yourself if you don't have the skills. But from an internal perspective, I think it's about fully understanding where those pillars within the ESG framework lie and what the impacts are within your business and understanding that part of the business. So whether you're being inducted as a new director or whether you've been on the board for a while, I think actually spending time interrogating that and really understanding how, you know, in the old days was sort of, do you understand where money is made? Well, fine, but do you understand where the ESG risks are and sustainability risks and opportunities lie within the business? I think that, you know, it's up to each director to make sure that they do have that awareness for themselves.
I like that, the way you just likened it to, you know, where do we make money? I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And Susan, what would you say is one of the key things in terms of understanding what we're doing internally?
Well, all of this is actually internal. We haven't got to reporting yet, but all of this is about business model transformation. I'm going to make a shameless plug for Chapter Zero at this point, because we set Chapter Zero up about 7 years ago in order to curate the information on the climate and sustainability with regards to what a board director needs to know. And I say a bit flippantly, you know, as a board director, we do nothing. We are not accountable for execution, but we are held accountable for the total performance of the company, both today and 5-10 years from now as well. And therefore, what we need to know is very different than what a CE needs to know. And I suppose, in a way, the good news is our depth does not have to be, it can be, but we don't have to be as in depth on this as the executives who will be executing on it. And what Chapter Zero does is, first of all, curate the information in light of this, but secondly, create toolkits and lists of questions that board members can understand they need to be answered in order for you to be able to make the right decisions as a board. So to kind of talk about what needs to be done is hard because we're all at different stages, but these toolkits provide a spectrum of opportunity for a board member to jump in at the bottom, the medium, or at the top of the learning curve to understand what questions do I need to be answering to make sure that the right outcome is going to be coming 3 to 5 years from now.
Good. So that's a really practical tip for everybody. So look for those Chapter Zero toolkits. I mean, my contribution to this question of what to look for, what to know about in the internal perspective is we often see boards who are unclear as to where the executive or managerial responsibility and accountability lies. So with sustainability being something that is spread across many different parts of the business, sometimes that responsibility and accountability can become too diffuse. And so it's difficult for a board to actually really understand beyond the CEO who is actually responsible. So getting some clarity around that and knowledge of how the organization is actually responding in practical terms and who's responsible is I think, really important. But
Yeah,
just
I mean, oh, sorry.
Sorry, go on. Yeah, please.
Sorry, no, I was just going to comment on that. And I
Mm.
think that's absolutely fundamental. I think creating that level of accountability and sort of as a board and looking at that overarching map of where things lie within the organization, I think is starting to create that accountability loop, which says who's accountable for what and how are we able to monitor it as a board, so that you can ensure that you are moving the organization forward. So I'm just going to come, yeah.
Good. Thanks. This question of external knowledge, maybe I'll kick off by just sharing a bit of experience recently from when I was doing the board review of a very large pension scheme. And one thing I learned in watching that board in action is how much activity there is amongst these large pension funds in terms of really driving the sustainability agenda. And there's huge information sharing, experience sharing, not just obviously in the UK, but globally. And there's large gatherings of sustainability experts from these massive investors to really drive the agenda. And I think boards often don't appreciate the position of the investment funds, or really understand what the investment funds are looking for or actually doing. Does that resonate with either of you?
If I'll jump in there. I mean, for me, pension funds have a long-term view, and that is why they are interested in sustainability, because they, like with insurance companies as well, recognize that there are risks on the horizon that if companies are not addressing today, make the company less attractive to invest in. By the way, all of this, we haven't talked about the elephant in the room, which is Trump and what Trump's doing out of the US and how that may or may not impact. I don't think that should detract from what we're talking about today, but the reality is this isn't going to be a straight line. And whereas, 1 month ago, I would have said that it's a safe bet to say, if you don't have sustainability embedded into your strategy by the end of this year or next, you will not be an investment opportunity for these pension funds. That may change now. And I think the waters have been muddied, but I still feel that the addressing of the business model today to be fit for purpose 10, 15 years from now is fundamental to ensuring future investments, such as the pension funds as well.
Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with that. I think obviously the conversation has sort of is, as Susan said, it's not a straight line, and certainly there are muddying of the waters. But I think we need to get back to basics, and that's where the conversation should start, is what's important to us as a business, what makes business sense for us. And regardless of the context and how the conversation might change, if you're on a path towards that, which says what is good for our business from a sustainable perspective, and how do we as a board drive and promote the success of the company for the long term, some of this is fundamental. So whether the conversation changes around the scoring or the regulation around it, I think your business fundamentals are still there. The risks are still there. Climate risks are still there. Those risks are still there. It's something that a board will still need to address. So I do think that, yes, there will be, the conversation might sort of waver a little bit. Regulation might soften, as we can potentially see happening in the EU now, where you sort of pulling back on sort of intent. But I don't think that was before Trump. But it's just the conversation will change. But that's why I think it's so important for a board to keep its focus on the core, what's important for us as a business and what's going to drive us forward from an opportunity perspective. And then hopefully those fundamentals will keep driving you, and you'll be ticking the sustainability boxes at the same time.
Right. I mean, Susan, how far do you feel that there's been a bit of a slippage over the last year or two, and in boards, instead of trying to really understand where investors are coming from, they've become a little bit obsessed and maybe frustrated with the reporting requirements? I mean, has the reporting burden sort of taken over the discussion in the boardroom and in the exco?
There's no question that reporting, we were in a sort of voluntary reporting market just 2 or 3 years ago. We now are beginning to focus on a few standards. But as love would have it, the UK and the European Union don't always have the same standards, which, of course, if you're an international company, makes it very challenging. I just keep on saying you've got to remind yourself that we are at the foothills of change. and these things will settle down, and they will become, as we learn more, they will become more constructive. And we are swinging from no kind of reporting to too much reporting, and we will find a happy medium where reporting makes sense to the company in trying to achieve this target. I do think, however, that the fact that the reporting can be excessive now places a requirement on leadership, and that's CEO, CFO, and board, to push back if it makes no sense to the company's outcome on this topic. The leadership should be explaining to investors. It is unfortunate, a lot of investors don't really know what they need to know yet. And this is not a criticism at all. It is a reality of being at the foothills. So I think there is too much regulation. I think companies need to be steeped in what is important, the materiality of this, and what needs to be reported and what targets they need to achieve, and needs to push back if excess resources are being used for things which bring no value to this discussion at all.
Lauren, any further
No,
thoughts?
no, I agree. I think regulation is both friend and foe. I think it's friend in if you are battling to get the conversation going, it's a good starting point to be a catalyst to bring about change within an organization. It's a foe where it's sort of consuming resources that could be better spent elsewhere in actually driving the agenda. And I agree. I think it's about your narrative, and that's the difficulty with sustainability and sustainability reporting is getting to that consistent, because everybody's story is different. And I think as long as you are able to tell your story, I think the investment community is probably more mature than it used to be in sort of acknowledging and being more accepting of a story that's told transparently, and sets out your story rather than one that is just ticking a regulatory box. So I do think, if I agree that if you're not in a position or it's counterproductive, then you should be pushing back. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, we haven't had many questions yet, so do please put your questions in the Q&A. So whilst we're waiting for more questions to come through, we'll carry on chatting a bit. And I want to come back to the question you raised, Susan, about if the CEO does not embrace the strategy and the change, what do you do? So what can a board do in practical terms to actually really get the CEO on board?
It's a very tough one, and I think the CEO is, in my mind, the pivotal leader in this whole equation, and I just think it's about following through on the regulations that are being reported on, and there are many which are now required, so all companies will be reporting on these, and making sure that you find a friend and colleague to support your efforts, either within the board, or often what we're seeing is that there is most often a chief sustainability officer or someone who is responsible for sustainability. And we've encouraged board members to work very closely with them, because if you've got the voice in the executive and on the board saying the same thing, that starts to get traction. I mean, in the worst of cases, if you have a CEO who absolutely refuses to do this, which I have never seen that happen, I think a board member has a decision to make about whether that's the right board to sit on. Because, and I think this is something we all have to remind ourselves of, it's your reputation at the end of the day. And if you sit on a board that is not doing the things that you feel is right with what you understand about the topic and the governance and the regulation, just staying on the board and disagreeing doesn't exculpate you from the responsibility of what then might happen. So a lot of this is conjecture at the moment, but I think you have to feel very strongly about the importance of this topic to do that. But nonetheless, it is our reputation, personal reputation at the end of the day, if something does happen when you are on the board and ultimately the accountable person or group of people.
Yeah. Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that, and I agree, Stephen. I think that whether you going on a board or working for a company, it's your own personal due diligence when you go onto that to understand what the value set is and the culture is within that organization, which doesn't mean you should never say no, because part of the challenge is trying to change a culture and to get an organization moving in a direction you want. I think there's lots of value to be had. And again, regulation, friend or foe, what investors are looking for. And I think the linkage of remuneration and scorecards and executive scorecards to sustainability outcomes is a great tool to have, and to look at ensuring that that's being implemented within an organization, because nothing changes behavior more than something that's being measured and potentially impacts remuneration outcomes. Not that you want that big stick, but that's just a practical way of looking at changing behavior and ensuring that you've got a chief executive who is somewhat engaged in your sustainability journey. But definitely, I think finding a champion amongst, whether it be fellow board members or the executive, is great, because there will be people who are passionate, and it's how you can try and encourage that and feed it into the board narrative so that it gets the attention that it needs. I think it is also a great practical way of trying to bring about change.
Yeah. I mean, I'd throw a couple of suggestions in. One also is if the CEO is not engaged and enthusiastic, it can be quite enlightening if the board then asks other members of his or her executive team what they are doing to drive the sustainability agenda. And if they are enthused and they are active, then that can actually expose the CEO, who may then be encouraged to be a bit more supportive. The other thing is...
sorry, Richard, sorry.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, another way we spoke about accountability being dispersed within an organization because of the various subject matter that fall within a sustainability agenda and the remit. And another way of doing it is, if you don't have the chief executive, if you have accountability at individual executive level within an organization, you can also drive it in that way. So it's almost this sort of groundswell coming up that's supporting sustainability, hopefully, and not necessarily just this chief executive alone who's responsible for driving it.
I mean, talking of the groundswell, how far would you say this is just innately connected with the D&I agenda, in the sense that we've got younger people in the organisation who are driven by a range of different things, but maybe have a different mindset from the 60-year-old board member. I mean, do you think the board should be really trying to hear much more of their opinions on not just diversity issues, but also on sustainability?
I think along with general stakeholder engagement, workforce engagement is a really powerful tool from a board perspective to get that voice being heard. And how you do it, obviously this is very varied in the UK alone as to how boards look at workforce engagement. But I think hearing that voice from the workforce, coming up, understanding what the culture is like, and getting the practical experience directly from employees is a great opportunity for board to enrich their exposure and experience around DE&I within the organization. You have organizations also looking at, there are lots of people talking about sort of shadow type boards with having young people informing discussions and decisions and whether that's it. So I think there are many ways of addressing and hearing that sort of voice coming through.
Susan, what are you seeing in terms of the impact of workforce engagement on driving the board agenda around sustainability?
I think it's not, workforce engagement per se is not specifically about sustainability. Sustainability is one pillar there. I do, by the way, I do push back when I hear, 60-year-old board members who may not think about this versus the youth. I think it's nothing age-related. I think you're either motivated by this topic, believe the scientists, and want to use the influence you have wherever you are in the organization to impact, or you don't. And I think the or you don't group is the one that is sometimes the hardest to do. The reality is, time and time again, the younger generations are making choices by the values that the companies espouse and deliver on. And one of those is often sustainability. Another would be on diversity and inclusion. And whatever governments say you have to do now is almost irrelevant, because there's a whole generation of people who are making choices about who they want to work for, what brands they want to buy, informed choices that will ultimately be a problem in talent for companies unless we address.
Yeah. So Leslie, do we have any questions yet? Or shall I raise one?
We do have questions, but feel free to raise one if you want, Richard.
Okay, well, I'll just do the, and then I'll just one more, and then we'll come to the participant questions. My question is, in very practical terms, what can a board do to really optimize the visibility of this sustainability agenda? You know, it's in the boardroom, or it's going through its whatever it is, quarterly, 6 times a year board meeting, and it's got its board committees. In terms of practical terms, what should it be demanding or looking for? Lauren?
Well, I mean, without, I think what you measure matters. So I think what goes onto the board agenda determines what the board is focusing its time on. So you have to have an agenda that's reflective of your sustainability journey. And I think that's absolutely key from a board practical perspective. And I go back to my original point around mapping where you are, where you want to be, your transition journey with your governance framework, and saying, okay, do I have a clear idea, and are we driving within our agenda? Are we asking the right questions, and are we getting accountability? Because I think that's the only way, if you create that accountability loop where you are driving what you want to see, and through that discussion and ongoing dialogue with the executive, you then drive behavior, and you're driving targets. And I think if you don't have those conversations, it's really quite difficult to move the conversation forward. And I also think looking at your culture as a board and how you might drive that, a couple of years ago when purpose and maybe it was post-COVID, but the buzzword was looking at purpose and everybody revisiting purpose, and lots of boards had a cultural moment, and they would talk about it, and you think about perhaps you change the culture within a board by talking about a sustainability moment or a net zero moment, or having people share experience within the board, and start creating that culture where it just becomes second nature, and it becomes the language of the board to have that integrated view around sustainability and what your sustainability agenda is. It's also determining, a last one would just be around board papers even, looking at how you're making sure that within any decision making as a process within the board, that it's not an add-on, and that it's integral into the papers being presented to you, that people are thinking about the impacts from a sustainability perspective. What are our opportunities? How does that impact our ambitions? Is it additive, or do we need to mitigate it in some way? And what are we doing before you make a decision? So I think a number of areas where
that's really helpful. Some good practical suggestions there. Susan, any others?
I don't know. I don't really have anything to add there. Can I just take a minute and talk about a tangible example of where I, as a board member, had to be really involved in sustainability, and now I actually am looking for what to do on the board because it is so embedded in the company. And perhaps rather surprisingly, the example is Uber. And I'll make this as short as I can, but basically in 2018, Sadiq Khan launched the ultra low emission zone, or mentioned it was coming. And if you didn't have, in this case, a fleet of electric vehicles, you'd basically be bound to business by 2025. This started rather painfully for Uber. We didn't have the money to help drivers transfer their cars. And slowly over a couple of years, we got an answer which allowed us to get to 100% EVs by 2025 in the UK, in London. What happened with that one little policy, because Uber stood to lose so much money on that, is that the CEO started to embrace it and say, if that's right for London, actually we ought to be looking at that globally. Within the next 3 years, the total corporate strategy has embraced electrifying the cars that their drivers drive in order to lessen the impact of this on cities. And it then went further from Uber Rides to Uber Eats as well. So they are now totally outside of their skill set, looking at recyclable packaging and all kinds of ways that they can make an impact on that. And Dara was at the Davos and was confronted, by all these, well, what are you going to do now? Because, Trump doesn't like sustainability. He doesn't like all of this. And Dara was basically saying, my riders are happier as a result of this. They love driving in electric vehicles. My drivers are happier because they've saved money, because the cost of ownership is much lower than an ICE car. I'm making money off this product. Why would I step back from it? And all of this, you know, has happened in that the whole culture now embraces this. Everyone talks about what they are doing to electrify or to reduce waste in Uber Eats. And I almost sit back as a board member and think, I don't need to know about this anymore. I just need to know what the KPIs are. You know, the metrics were there for a while. They're not necessary now because it's part of the culture throughout the organization. It's wonderful to have an example. There aren't that many out there, but when the board and the CEO and the execs embrace it, you know, it happens.
Right.
And money is made as well. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to generalize on that because not everyone's the same, but you know, there are ways of getting past the initial hurdles. I see a number of questions on the investments needed and ROI. You know, the question is more the risk of not doing anything is far higher. Could I give you an ROI on it? Probably not. Than actually starting to make things happen and seeing the art of the possible with regards to the upsides and opportunities.
Yeah, great example. Get a wedge in the door and then all sorts of things can happen. So Leslie, what have we got in terms of questions?
We've got several questions all around the whole thing about what's going on in America at the moment. BP sort of stepping back from oil and gas, and also sort of how you deal with different investors' reactions. I don't know, you have covered this a little bit as the questions were coming in, but I just wondered if you wanted, do you think, what's your view? Do you really think that investors are going to stop worrying about sustainability?
Well, okay, I just think it's to do with the business logic. I mean, Susan was just giving a great example of
Yeah.
why it makes so much sense in itself, regardless of what's happening around you. And if you can identify that business logic, and possibly also the moral imperative, then these things are going to happen anyway. So, Lauren, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I agree completely. I think that the conversation might change, and it might have less emphasis in sort of from a public perspective. But I think the reason, and I'm always cautious of saying this because there's so many studies which prove that, but the reality is a company that looks after sustainability and is concerned with sustainability issues is better managed just because of the focus that it has around risk and opportunity. So that performance and that desire to have better sustainable performance in the long term, I think investors, the right investors, are going to be still interested in. So I don't think that necessarily is going to change. I think as long as what you're doing is good for the business and makes good long-term business sense, I think that there will be the investor support for it. I do think it's unfortunate, obviously, with the current dialogue and rhetoric that the emphasis and the focus is changing. But I do think it's also a question of just keeping focus as a board on making sure that, and we talk about different generations, but to talk about a Generation X or Generation Z, you do what makes sense for you as a business. You make sure that you are focusing on those particular areas around sustainability that are going to drive the business forward. And I think that will remain. I don't think that's going to change.
Susan?
I don't really have anything to add to that other than I think all of the relationships that companies have with employees, with stakeholders, with investors is in the process of changing now. And actually, the investors carry as much accountability for the outcomes of these companies as do the companies themselves. And I do see a much closer relationship forming between companies and investors in terms of even companies saying, I don't want you to invest in me because we're about change and transformation and sustainability, and you are looking for predictable quarterly returns, which as we go through this transition are not to be, you know, guaranteed. And we need investors to work together with companies to understand the hurdles that you have to overcome to get past those. So I think the only thing to say is the ground is shifting everywhere at the moment, and we have to get used to that and embrace it and try and constantly evaluate where the opportunities come up to keep the momentum, but also to do things differently. Everything, I mean, that the one thing Trump is doing very, very well at the moment is changing the nature of everything that we consider to be normal. And actually the good side of that is So if that's no longer normal, how else could we do it without losing sight of the goal that we're trying to get to?
Yeah. And I guess as the ground is shifting, one of the things that hasn't changed is the science. I've read this morning in response to all of this that, oh yes, but the science hasn't changed. Maybe some of the nuances of the business imperatives, the short-term business imperatives, at least, have changed to a degree, but the science remains the same. So I'd always bear that in mind. What else have we got, Leslie?
So we've got someone who's an experienced board reviewer saying that boards might have an ESG strategy which is clear enough on scope 1 and 2, but there is still a big gap under scope 3 as these require working with others such as your suppliers. Do you share that perspective?
Lauren?
I mean, I think, yes, it's harder. It's a question of availability of data. It's a question of reliability on others. But I think there are, so yes, the answer is yes, I do share that view that I think scope 3 is obviously that much harder, but not impossible. And I think it's how you work with your suppliers and how you look at implementing processes to get that data. But yes, there is that dependence on data. And that's part of what you should be looking at as a board around sort of what your climate ambitions are and your sort of transition path and whether you're going to get there or not is also the external dependencies that you may have and what may impact and how you can track those. But I agree with you. I think it's obviously I think that's still work in progress for many in trying to understand what is scope 3 emissions and getting the data, the relevant data.
Is that how you see it, Susan?
It's a tough scope to deal with, and most of the boards I've ever sat on, it's 98% scope 3, and so you do have to work out how you work through it. But an awful lot is happening on this, and this is actually the scope where I see the use of the word collaboration actually really happening, where larger companies are setting up the ability to review, train, and develop suppliers in a way that becomes affordable for smaller companies. So again, foothills of change. I believe scope 3 will morph into something slightly different in time because it is hard, not just to know what to do, but how to measure. But to look out for all the groups that already exist working on this, and also recognizing that, for every scope 3, that's someone else's scope 1 and 2. And, they need to understand and have the resources available to start to bring in the changes necessary to keep their business going.
Yeah. Well, many of the boards I look at, I mean, over the years, I think our boards have often struggled to really focus on the third party angle. It's natural for boards to look very internally at what's happening. The one thing I have noticed is that on cyber risk, boards have become much more attuned and sensitive to the risks presented by third parties, their supply chain, but their intermediaries. And I think that's also going to encourage them to look much more closely at the scope 3, the external dependencies and the impact and the sustainability angles of the relationships they have with third parties. Leslie.
Next one.
Next?
So we've been asked, what is the latest on TPT, and is this still the right tool for boards to structure climate risk oversight?
Oh, getting a bit more technical now. Lauren.
I think Susan was going to answer. She's probably better placed.
Susan's probably the best.
But this is actually been the focus of Chapter 0. I think that was Friedrich Otto. So hi, Friedrich. We know each other as well. So he may have planted that one for me. But the TPT, I love and hate it. The TPT framework is very structured, incredibly structured, and so structured that sometimes my eyes glaze over and think, where do I start on this? We've been holding at Chapter 0 sort of master classes on it. And this is kind of a tension because we're not meant to become experts in this. And yet you really need to know what needs to be in place in order
Susan, can I just interrupt you for a second? For those of you who aren't for the audience who aren't familiar with the TPT framework, could you give a 20-second masterclass?
It's the Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework. So it's basically giving you step-by-step journey of how to get to where you will need to be to ensure that the value of the company in the future is there based on your ability to deliver on sustainable topics. So it goes through 3 pillars: ambition, action, and accountability. So it touches on all of the stuff that we've already talked about, like vision for the future, the importance of the strategy going through the organization, and then how you measure it and how you govern it. So it goes through all of that. It's very consulting-y, but it's really thought about everything. And another overlay that it has is about the just transition. That meaning mainly, if you have to close down something, how are you going to reskill the workers? How are you going to help those who are going to be disadvantaged by any kind of transition that you follow? So it's a great piece of work. It's very structured, and it's possibly overkill for some small companies. But it gives you something to hang on to and to focus on to know if you've made progress or not. Because one of the hardest things now in this period, we're all board directors, we have impact in the next 3 to 5 years, or influence, I should say, but our impact is going to continue for much longer. We need to get it right. And this framework gives you the structure around which you can have more confidence to know where your company may be falling short or where it's excelling as well. And that's really important to celebrate when it is going well.
So should boards be actively using the TPT framework? Should
They have to. It's coming in as a regulation. Right. Yeah. So it's coming in. It's not there yet. It's a really useful thing to understand as a board member. And it's quite, what do you call it? Prescriptive, you know, like it or not, but it's prescriptive, but it's the homework's been done for us on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good framework for companies, for those who are less mature in their journey, and because it's not prescriptive, because it's not mandatory yet, I think it's a good exercise to at least follow the framework and see where you are and how you might respond to it if you were answering it. I think it does provide a decent set of questions for you to respond to.
Good. Leslie, we've probably got time for one more question at least.
Okay, so which of the teams internally do you think non-executive directors could use more sustainability support from? For example, would it be internal audit, risk, legal, HR, procurement? And obviously it depends on the business model, but are you seeing any patterns across companies?
I think it's a bit of everything. I think that and that goes to the concept of integration and making sure that everybody's got a focus. But certainly, you know, once you've set up a framework, once you've got your targets, internal audit will have a role in making sure that you are driving towards those targets. Do legal have a role to play? Absolutely. I think one of the key things for boards to understand is you know, where we're going with litigation and different standards boards, and how you know, what's trending, and legal department not only in ensuring compliance and legality with what you're doing, but also keeping the board aware of what's trending from a litigation perspective and how you positioned in relation to that. I think there's a lot more, there are a lot more challenges globally around climate and what boards are doing and how they're measuring it. So again, a bit of legal departments. I think in each way, HR has got a role in ensuring that we're driving the right behaviors through a REM process. So I think to me, it's about integration and understanding where in the organization, who's got what role to play, and making sure that everybody's driving and is behind that.
Yeah, I think it ties into a lot of what we've been saying around accountability and clarity of that, but I would agree it goes across the organization, which comes back to Susan's point about the ownership by the CEO. I mean, ultimately, the CEO has to be the linchpin, pulling all of these threads together and making sure that the effort is being put in across all of these different parts of the organization.
And I think, sorry, just as an add-on to that, is that I think it's also then about, from a board perspective, ensuring that because it is so dispersed across the organization, I guess I'm sometimes concerned whether there's sufficient resources being given to it. And you know, you'll always hear an audit committee's question going out to the internal auditor or to the risk manager from the audit committee members. You know, do you think your resources are sufficient to do the job you need to do? And I just question if the same thing is being asked of your chief sustainability officer or people who are involved in this process, as the sort of ask becomes that much bigger. Are we ensuring that there are sufficient resources that the executive are giving towards the topics? Yeah.
One thing I would add is to make sure you don't heap too much on internal audit. I mean, there's always a danger that because internal audit has to look across the organization and a whole many different parts of the control environment, that their agenda just keeps on expanding. Yes, at some point they'll need to look at the controls around the sustainability reporting, but there's a limit really to what can be asked of them.
I mean, all of this is sort of, if you keep in mind that when you've arrived, when it's integrated into your company, everyone is responsible, and you don't have to worry about this. So this question for me is more about how, if it's not moving at the pace you want to, how best to include, where best to start. And originally, when I was sitting on an airline board once, and we were just grappling with sustainability, rather shockingly, only a couple of years ago, and it was given to the audit committee, so it became audit and sustainability committee. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. But actually, in retrospect, I kind of think, who cares if that's the way you enter into this discussion? Once you start to find out what the details are, then it starts to, expand in its area. But once you've achieved what we're trying to achieve with all this transition planning, you don't have to worry about where it sits. It is embedded into the business. So for me, it really depends on the company, how the leadership is feeling, where the competencies lie within your organization, whether it's at board or in various parts of it. And I do think the legal side is a really important one, which would sit actually with the COSEC, for example, because they will have to know what, requirements are there. So I hate to say it all the time, but it depends. It depends where you are and who you've got leading you through this.
Thank you very much. I think we probably have come to the end now. I don't think there's time to answer any other questions. Just like to thank all of our panelists on your behalf for an absolutely fascinating discussion. And it's so complex, it's so varied, it's so moving, as in earth moving, not as in being affectionate about it. But it's just a really difficult topic, but you have explained it so well, and really thank you. And thanks to all of you. I'm sorry for those of you who didn't manage to answer all your questions, but I hope you found it useful. And as I say, we will be sharing the recording with you probably beginning of next week, and would encourage you to go and have a look at the governance, sign up for our free newsletter to keep you informed. Thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you next time.